The crystal chandeliers of Buckingham Palace cast brilliant light across the opulent state dining room as London's cultural elite mingled with Hollywood royalty at the exclusive reception following the royal film performance. October 14, 1983. Al Pacino stood near the ornate fireplace, wearing an impeccably tailored black dinner jacket, his bow tie perfectly straight, nursing a glass of champagne while observing the carefully orchestrated dance of British high society. At 43, he was at the height of his international fame, but nothing in his South Bronx upbringing had prepared him for this level of aristocratic formality. But something was about to happen that would shatter the evening's polite veneer and create a scandal that would be whispered about in palace corridors for decades. The evening had begun smoothly enough. Al had attended the royal film performance of Scarface at the Odeon Leicester Square, where he'd been presented to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in the traditional receiving line. The Queen had been gracious, asking intelligent questions about his preparation for the role of Tony Montana, and Al had responded with the respectful deference that protocol demanded. Now, at the post-screening reception, Al found himself surrounded by the usual mix of industry professionals and British nobility who attended such events, people who moved through these gatherings with the practiced ease of those born to privilege, speaking in the clipped accents and subtle references that marked them as members of an exclusive club. "Mr. Pacino," came a voice from behind him, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to immediate attention. Al turned to see Prince Edward approaching, the Queen's youngest son, 29 years old and radiating the particular confidence that came from never having to prove one's worth to anyone. Beside him walked Lady Catherine Pembroke, a distant cousin of the royal family whose title dated back 4 centuries and whose fortune had been built on land grants that predated America itself. "Your Highness," Al said, offering the slight bow that protocol required, his voice respectful but not deferential. "Quite an intense performance tonight," Prince Edward said, his tone carrying the kind of polite condescension that British aristocracy had perfected over centuries. "Very American, wasn't it?" The comment could have been taken as praise, but something in the prince's tone suggested it wasn't entirely complimentary. Lady Catherine smiled with the practiced expression of someone who'd spent her life perfecting the art of appearing pleasant while delivering subtle insults. "I tried to make Tony Montana as authentic as possible," Al replied carefully, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere more dangerous than typical post-screening small talk. "Authentic," Lady Catherine repeated, her voice carrying the crisp pronunciation that marked her as products of the finest British education money and breeding could provide. "How fascinating that you should use that word." Al's internal warning systems began to activate. He'd spent enough time in Hollywood to recognize when someone was setting him up for something unpleasant, and both royals were displaying the particular kind of predatory attention that preceded a deliberate attack. "Lady Catherine was just mentioning," Prince Edward continued, "how remarkable it is that American cinema has become so populist in recent years. All that shouting and violence, designed to appeal to the masses rather than elevate them." The criticism was delivered with surgical precision, attacking not just Scarface, but Al's entire artistic approach while maintaining the facade of intellectual discourse. Several other guests had begun to drift toward their conversation, perhaps sensing that something more significant than polite chit-chat was developing. "I suppose," Lady Catherine added, "it must be quite lucrative, giving audiences what they want rather than what they need. Though one does wonder about the cultural cost of such commercial considerations." Al felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he maintained his composed exterior. This was clearly a coordinated attack, designed to put him in his place while maintaining the pretense of civilized conversation. "Art has always served different purposes," Al replied diplomatically. "Some artists create beauty, others explore truth, still others challenge audiences to confront uncomfortable realities." "How noble," Prince Edward said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Though one might question whether what you do can properly be called art at all." The comment landed like a slap across the face. Several nearby conversations stopped as guests realized that Prince Edward had just publicly questioned Al Pacino's artistic legitimacy in the state dining room of Buckingham Palace. Al's composure flickered for just a moment, but that moment was enough for Lady Catherine to press the attack. "What His Royal Highness means," she said with false sweetness, "is that there's traditionally been a rather clear distinction between serious artistic endeavor and mere entertainment. Between those who create lasting cultural value and those who simply perform for money. The insult was devastating in its elegant cruelty. They were essentially calling Al a highly paid court jester, someone who provided temporary distraction for the masses but whose work had no lasting significance. "I see," Al said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge that made several guests step closer, sensing that the evening's polite formalities were about to be abandoned. Prince Edward, perhaps mistaking Al's controlled response for submission, decided to deliver the killing blow. "Please don't misunderstand," he said with mock sympathy. "We're not criticizing your profession. Acting is certainly a legitimate trade. But let's be honest about what it is. You're essentially a very skilled craftsman who performs other people's words for the entertainment of paying customers." The prince paused, his expression taking on the condescending patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "You're not a writer, you're not a composer, you're not a painter or sculptor creating original works of lasting significance. You're just an actor. A very successful one, certainly, but at the end of the day, just someone who pretends to be other people for money." The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Prince Edward had just reduced one of America's greatest actors to the level of a street performer, dismissing decades of artistic achievement as mere pretending in front of an audience that included some of Britain's most powerful cultural figures. Lady Catherine smiled with obvious satisfaction, clearly believing that Al had been effectively put in his place through superior breeding and intellect. But they had made a critical error in judgment. They had attacked not just Al Pacino the actor, but Al Pacino the artist, Al Pacino the working-class kid from the South Bronx who had fought for every moment of respect he'd ever received. And they had done it in a room full of witnesses, making retreat impossible and response inevitable. Al set his champagne glass down on a nearby table with deliberate care, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made everyone watching suddenly more alert. When he looked up at Prince Edward and Lady Catherine, something in his expression had changed. The respectful deference he'd shown earlier was gone, replaced by the kind of focused intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. "Your Royal Highness," Al said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the suddenly silent dining room, "may I ask you something?" Prince Edward nodded, perhaps not yet realizing that he had just awakened something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "In your 29 years of life, what have you created? What original work have you contributed to human culture? What lasting achievement bears your name that isn't simply an accident of birth?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Al had just challenged a member of the British royal family to justify his own existence in front of the cultural elite of London. But Al wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. And what happened next would shock not just the palace, but reshape how everyone present understood the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. And what happened next would shock not just the palace, but reshape how everyone present understood the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. Prince Edward's face flushed red as the implications of Al's challenge sank in. Lady Catherine's practiced smile faltered, perhaps realizing that their victim had just turned predator with surgical precision. The dining room had gone completely silent, every guest understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the palace's 300-year history. "I beg your pardon." Prince Edward managed, his voice carrying the outraged tone of someone who'd never been questioned about his accomplishments in public. Al stepped closer, not threatening but commanding, his presence suddenly filling the space around them with an energy that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. "I asked what you've created," Al said, his voice gaining strength and focus. "Because you just spent 5 minutes dismissing my life's work as just acting, so I'm curious about what qualifies you to make that judgment." The attack was devastating in its simplicity. Al had turned the tables completely, forcing Prince Edward to defend achievements he'd never been required to justify. I serve the crown," Prince Edward stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "I represent British interests around the world, I support numerous charities." "You attend events," Al interrupted, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous. You cut ribbons, you shake hands, you give speeches written by other people to audiences who applaud because they have to, not because you've earned their respect. Lady Catherine tried to intervene. Mr. Pacino, surely you understand the importance of public service. Public service? Al turned his attention to her with laser focus. Let me tell you about public service, Lady Catherine. Public service is spending 6 months learning what it feels like to be Frank Serpico, a real police officer who risked his life to expose corruption because he believed that protecting innocent people was worth more than his own safety. Al began moving around the dining room, his energy electric but controlled, like a professor delivering the most important lecture of his career. Public service is understanding what it costs psychologically to become Michael Corleone, to explore how good men become monsters when they choose family loyalty over moral principles. Public service is using your platform to force audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and the American dream. The guests were transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a celebrity disagreement. This was a fundamental clash between two different definitions of value and purpose. You want to know what "just an actor" means, Your Royal Highness? Al asked, his voice building with passionate conviction. It means spending years learning to disappear completely into other human beings' psychology. It means risking your sanity, your relationships, your personal stability to find truth in characters that most people don't have the courage to explore. Prince Edward opened his mouth to respond, but Al was building momentum now, his words carrying the kind of controlled power that had defined his greatest performances. It means taking Tony Montana, a character that could have been a cartoon villain, and finding the desperate immigrant inside him who believes so completely in the American dream that he's willing to destroy everything beautiful about himself to achieve it. Al stopped directly in front of the royal table where the Queen's portrait watched over the proceedings with painted serenity. And then it means standing in front of audiences around the world and letting them see that desperate immigrant, letting them recognize their own ambition and their own capacity for moral compromise, forcing them to ask themselves what they would sacrifice for success. The silence was absolute. Even the palace staff, trained to be invisible during such events, had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. That's not entertainment, Your Royal Highness, Al said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. That's not pretending for money. That's using human psychology as raw material to create experiences that change how people understand themselves and their world. Al looked around the dining room, taking in the faces of Britain's cultural elite who were watching him with a mixture of awe and shock. You dismissed me as just an actor because you think acting is about putting on costumes and reciting lines. But real acting, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, is about having the courage to explore the darkest and most complex parts of human nature and then sharing what you discover with anyone brave enough to watch. Lady Catherine tried once more to regain control. Mr. Pacino, surely you can appreciate the difference between inherited responsibility and inherited responsibility? Al's voice took on a harder edge. You inherited titles, you inherited wealth, you inherited respect that you never earned. I inherited nothing except the determination to create something meaningful with my life. Al moved closer to both royals, his intensity building but remaining completely controlled. I grew up in the South Bronx, Lady Catherine. My grandfather was a plasterer, my father abandoned the family when I was 2, my mother worked multiple jobs to keep us from starving. I didn't inherit anything except the understanding that if you want respect in this world, you have to earn it. The room was electric with tension. Al had just delivered a masterclass in the difference between earned and inherited status, and everyone present understood its implications. So when you tell me I'm just an actor, Al continued, you're telling me that 30 years of learning my craft, 30 years of risking everything to create authentic performances, 30 years of using art to explore what it means to be human, all of that is less valuable than being born into the right family. Prince Edward's composure was now completely shattered. That's not what I meant. No, that's exactly what you meant, Al replied with devastating clarity. You meant that inherited privilege is superior to earned achievement. You meant that titles matter more than talent, that bloodlines matter more than dedication. Al looked directly at both royals, his dark eyes carrying the kind of focused energy that had made him one of the most compelling performers of his generation. But here's what you don't understand about America, about American art, about what I represent. We don't believe that anyone is born better than anyone else. We believe that what matters is what you do with your life, not who your parents were. The statement was revolutionary in its context, challenging the very foundation of monarchy and aristocracy in the heart of the British establishment. Every character I've ever played, every performance I've ever given, represents the idea that human value comes from human achievement, not human pedigree. That a plasterer's grandson from the Bronx can create art that moves people around the world if he's willing to work harder than anyone else and never compromise his vision. Al paused, letting his words settle over the silent dining room like a judgment. And that art, that dangerous, uncomfortable, uncompromising art that forces people to confront their own capacity for both good and evil, that art will be remembered long after your titles are forgotten. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Prince Edward and Lady Catherine stood speechless, their earlier arrogance completely dismantled by Al's passionate defense of earned achievement over inherited privilege. But Al wasn't finished. He had one final point to make, one that would ensure this moment was never forgotten by anyone present. You want to know the difference between what I do and what you do? Al asked, his voice taking on a new quality that commanded absolute attention. When I die, people will study Michael Corleone and Frank Serpico and Tony Montana to understand what it meant to be human in the 20th century. They'll analyze those performances in universities, they'll write books about the psychological truth I brought to those characters, they'll use my work to explore fundamental questions about power and morality and the cost of ambition. Al looked around the room one final time, his gaze taking in every face that was watching him with newfound respect. But when you die, Your Royal Highness, the only thing people will remember is that you were born into the right family and attended the right events and cut the right ribbons. Your entire life's work will fit on a single line in a history book: he existed. The devastation was complete. Al had not only defended his own artistic achievements but had challenged the entire concept of aristocratic value in terms so clear and powerful that no response was possible. Prince Edward stood frozen, his face pale, perhaps understanding for the first time in his life that inherited status meant nothing when confronted with genuine achievement and authentic passion. Lady Catherine looked around desperately for support, but found only faces reflecting the same awed recognition that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Al straightened his bow tie with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. "Thank you for a fascinating conversation," he said politely, his voice returning to the respectful tone he'd used at the beginning of the evening. "I hope you'll forgive me if I don't stay for the remainder of the reception. I have work to do." With that, Al walked out of the state dining room, leaving behind a palace full of people who would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the night Al Pacino redefined the relationship between art and aristocracy. Word of the confrontation spread through London's cultural circles within hours. By the next morning, every major newspaper was reporting on the American actor who shocked the palace with his passionate defense of artistic achievement. Prince Edward never publicly commented on the encounter, but palace insiders noted that his subsequent public appearances showed newfound respect for artists and performers. He never again made dismissive comments about mere entertainers. The Queen herself, when asked privately about the incident, reportedly said that she found Al's passion for his craft quite admirable, and that perhaps we could all benefit from such dedication to our work. Years later, when film scholars studied the impact of American actors on British culture, Al's confrontation with Prince Edward would be cited as a watershed moment, the night when earned achievement definitively triumphed over inherited privilege in the court of public opinion. Al never spoke publicly about the incident, but his subsequent performances carried an even deeper commitment to exploring the psychology of power and the cost of ambition, as if his encounter with royalty had reinforced his understanding that true nobility comes not from bloodlines, but from the courage to create something meaningful with your life.